Okay, what we're going to do today is start learning about Chapter 18, which are goods and services. There are 3 sections to Chapter 18,
Everybody, this
and those sections are American production, distributing goods, and you, the consumer. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to switch over to Microsoft PowerPoint from time to time, and I'm going to type in notes. This is exactly the same thing as if I were writing notes on the board. So anything that I type in Microsoft PowerPoint, you need to write down in your notes as if they were notes on the board. Okay, our objectives for Section 1, American production, are: what are the main features of modern mass production? How have the sources of power used by American factories changed since the early years of the country? And what makes the profit motive an effective driver of the U.S. economic system? Okay, main features of modern mass production. First of all, we have machine tools. Machine tools are produced parts that are exactly the same. This concept was very first introduced by Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney also came up with the concept of what were known as interchangeable parts. Okay, so you should have that written down in your notes, that Eli Whitney came up with the concept of interchangeable parts. What happened was Eli Whitney was contracted by the U.S. government to make rifles for our military. Prior to Eli Whitney and his idea of interchangeable parts, when someone purchased an item and if a part broke, instead of just replacing that one part, they had to completely discard the entire item. Eli Whitney came up with the idea of just make more parts, and that way you only replace the part instead of the entire item. I know that in today's society that sounds like a very basic concept, but back during Eli Whitney's times in the 1800s, no one had ever thought of this before. So this is actually a very groundbreaking idea and groundbreaking concept. Interchangeable parts are made by machine tools, and interchangeable parts easily fit with other parts and are easily replaced. So again, instead of replacing the entire item, all you have to do is replace the one part. Now, when you add interchangeable parts and machine tools with division of labor, you end up with what becomes known as mass production. Division of labor is a specialization in each area of production that speeds up the process. Another word for division of labor, or another way of putting division of labor, is the assembly line. The assembly line is when machines and workers move products through production stages. Henry Ford is the man that came up with the idea of the assembly line. And the way that Henry Ford came up with the idea was rather unique. Henry Ford visited a meatpacking plant in Chicago, and he watched how a cow was brought in and to the gate, and they closed the gate and they killed the cow, and then from there it went right on down the line. It went to the next stage where they actually had to slice it open and gut it out. And then from there, they took the hide off. From there, then they quartered it out. And then it just went through a process, and it just moved right on down this line. And Henry Ford thought to himself, I could do something like this with my automobiles. Prior to Henry Ford coming up with the idea of the assembly line, what they did was that they had anywhere from about 5 to 10 men, and they basically had all of the parts for a car sitting in one area. They had the frame, they had the suspension, the tires, the wheels, the seats, the body, the motor. Everything was just all in one area, and they slowly started to assemble it one by one. Well, this took a very long time, and so because it took so long, it meant the price was going to be even higher. When Henry Ford introduced the assembly line, instead of it taking several hours to assemble one car, now it was cut down to less than 40 minutes. This allowed the price of the automobile to decrease. So in 1908, a Model T cost just over $800. Now in today's society, that sounds like it's very cheap. However, if I go to what's known as an inflation calculator, I can show you that $825, which is basically what a Model T cost back in 1908, but I can only go back to 1913. But $825 in 1913 and today is $19,835.92. Now, in 1924, after the assembly line was introduced, the price was decreased from $825 down to $495. Now, $495 in 1924 is like $6,890 today. So you can see that Henry Ford dropped the price of the car by 2.5 times. So you could buy 2 cars in 1924 for the same price that would have cost you to buy 1 car back in 1908. And that is all due to the introduction of the assembly line by Henry Ford. And so today, I was just watching the news last night, and the most popular selling vehicle in all of the United States is the Ford F-150 pickup. And they actually, one of these pickups rolls off of the assembly line every 18 seconds. Think about that. Every 18 seconds, one of these vehicles is made. Now, obviously, they have robots that do the majority of the work today. They do the painting, they do the welding. You still have to have people that have to sit and monitor these machines, and you have people that also have to do other installations with more parts of the motor and things like that. But robots or machines do the majority of the work. Next, we are going to go to changing power sources. Now, if all of this production is going to take place, the factories have to have a power source. And early on, the power source was water. And so what would happen is that some of the earliest and best examples of this were what were called flour mills. Flour mills were built right next to streams. And the flour mill would be constructed right next to, on the banks of a stream or small river, and then a channel would be dug that would branch off of the river or stream and would go right next to the flour mill. A wooden wheel with compartments would then be over the stream, and as they would unlock that wheel, each one of those compartments would fill with water, and that would cause that wheel to turn. When that wheel would turn, there was a long wooden shaft that went from the wheel into the flour mill, and that turned grinding stones. And so the miller, that was the person that worked at the flour mill, they would take wheat or corn and they would put that on these stones, and as the wheel would turn, it would cause one stone that laid flat to spin and another one that was vertical to spin. And then when the wheat or the corn would go through that, it would get ground up, and over time it would turn to flour. And then at the end of the day, all the miller had to do was lock the wheel in place and it would no longer spin. The water would continue to flow, the wheel just wouldn't spin. Well, then what happened is that people began to realize, and I'm guessing this is probably by accident, that if you put a pot of water over a flame and as it warms up, it produces steam. Well, if you put a lid over it, that steam builds and builds and builds and builds, and eventually, if you don't take the lid off, so much pressure is built up that it will literally blow the lid off. And people realize, wow, that was a tremendous amount of power there. I wonder if there's some way that we can harness that power. And so what they would do is they would fill up large containers full of water, they would apply a heat source, and then as that steam would build up, they could put gauges on there and they would see how much pressure was building up. And they knew that if they didn't release some of that steam, that eventually it would blow up. And so they could slowly release that steam, and that steam would produce power. So for example, the early locomotives that ran on our railroads were steam locomotives. On each side of the engine were large compartments, and that's where they kept the water. And then the car right behind the engine would have, at first it would have wood in it, and then there was a compartment just like a large wood burning stove, and they would throw the wood in there and heat up the fire, and then the engineer would slowly start to release that steam, and that's what powered the locomotive right on down the tracks. Later on, they began to use coal. If you've ever watched movies from the Old West, and when you saw a train pulling into the station, you would see a large wooden, almost look wooden container, a huge platform, and like a water tower. And the reason that was there is that obviously as that water boils and that steam is released, the water is going to evaporate, and you're going to have to replace it. So those water towers that were placed right next to the train station, so that as the people were unloading, they could refill those tanks with water that were on the locomotive. So then when it was time to go, they would start throwing more wood or coal back into the fire, and as the fire would heat up, that water would boil, it would create steam, and then they could slowly start to release that steam, and that would power the train right on down the track. Now, we've learned that profit motive is what drives our economy, and people are willing to take big risks if there's the chance to make big profit. We've gone through some of these individuals that have taken some pretty big risks when it came to starting up their businesses. One person that I want to mention, and this is a person that is mentioned in the textbook, is a man by the name of Michael Dell. And I believe we know him because he is the founder of Dell Computers. And just like any businessman, Michael Dell had to take big chances when he wanted to start his computer business. And